Whistlebury and the Christmas That Changed Everything by Matt Plummer. In Whistlebury, Christmas wasn't just a holiday. It was part of who the town was. You could say that is what happens when you're home to the first Christmas tree farm. Grandpa Joe Whistler planted the first little fir 67 years ago, and he didn't look back. That one little fir turned into 20, and 20 into 200. Before long, there were trucks full of trees chugging down the forest roads to bring the most beautiful, perfectly shaped trees to the rest of the region. You couldn't drive through Whistlebury after Thanksgiving without smelling pine wafting through the air. While the folks of Whistlebury were happy to send their trees all around the state, they took the most pride in the 60-foot great pine Grandpa Whistler had planted in the center of town just 2 years after he got his start. The great pine was perfect. Tall, magnificent, branches straight as an arrow and strong, needles glistening, perfect green. And the people of Whistlebury gathered around the great pine all Christmas season for carol singing, cookie decorating contests, nativity plays, and snowman building contests. Christmas couldn't get any better in Whistlebury. That is, until years of wet winters introduced root rot to Whistlebury's beautiful pine collection. The first year, 1 or 2 trees caught root rot and had to be cut down prematurely. But just as Grandpa Joe's tree farm grew quickly from 1 tree to hundreds, so did the root rot over the next few years. What was once beautiful waves of green needles now were stumps awkwardly dotting the hillsides. As tree after tree went down, the magic of Whistlebury seemed to go with them. Christmas brought fear rather than the joy that had filled every home. Would we have enough trees to sell this year? Would we all be able to find the perfect tree for our homes, as we always had? For 5 years, it was a slow decline, but then the rotting took a fateful turn, a turn no one ever could have imagined could happen. Yes, hundreds of other trees had been killed off, but still no one ever expected the tree epidemic to touch the great pine. And yet it did. It happened slowly at first as the air was beginning to get brisk at night, causing a branch here and a branch there to die. And then, in the week leading up to Thanksgiving, the rest of the town's landmark, icon, and more importantly, hope, was gone. Walking through Whistlebury that Thanksgiving, you saw many blank stares. No one knew what to say or how to act. Whispered questions of whether Whistlebury would still exist echoed through the streets. The town felt strange, like it had a big hole in its core. But Grandpa Joe had planned for something like this. When you were around trees your whole life, as he was, you know that no tree is invincible, even the great pine. Grandpa Joe didn't just have one plan, but 2 plans. He had planted a tree for each of his 2 sons on the opposing sides of town in his last days, so that if something ever happened to the great pine, they would have 2 options. The people of Whistlebury weren't ready to think about Grandpa Joe's backup plans for most of the week, but eventually some of the more practical folks began to discuss what would be done for Christmas this year. Grandpa Joe's sons, Mark and Eric, took turns surveying their trees and walking the town's leaders around their great junior pines. At first, the conversation focused on the objective qualities of the 2 trees, but after days of discussion, the lure of having claim to the town's new icon, and as a result, overseeing the holiday festivities each year, was too much for the 2 brothers' egos. The conversation had been about what would best serve the community, which location would afford the most parking, which direction the wind came over the hillside, which tree was easier to get power to, the practical considerations. In days, however, the conversation turned surprisingly more philosophical. Mark's tree came to represent freedom, a sign of strength and independence, while supporting Eric's tree meant you were taking a stand for justice and leaving no one behind. How 2 trees came to represent deeply held values in the span of lighting 2 Advent candles was hard to say, but that it did something strange to the people of Whistlebury was unmistakable. The same people who held hands and sang "Santa Claus is coming to town" and pulled each other's kids up the town sledding hill a year earlier now found themselves on opposite sides of a surprisingly vicious battle of the trees. Town meetings changed overnight. Rather than picking a theme for this year's cookie decorating contest, they became yelling matches where pre-written rants dug up deeply personal dirt on the Whistler brothers, their families, and ultimately anyone who had ever associated with either of them. The brothers, who had together flicked the switch at the tree lighting ceremony for the last 11 years, stopped talking. Worse, they were like birds of prey, looking for even the smallest opportunity to tear down their sibling. Media from as far as the coast flocked to Whistlebury to cover what national outlets branded the Battle of the Trees. Now, it may have seemed trivial, almost silly to an outsider, to tear a community apart because of 2 pine trees. But that's the thing. The battle had started out being about 2 trees, but now it was something much deeper. It was about ideals, values, deeply held personal beliefs. To the people of Whistlebury, this decision wouldn't just decide where the Christmas parade would end. It would decide the future of Whistlebury and determine what type of people the children of Whistlebury would become. This spiral into name-calling, division, and hatred got worse every day, even as Christmas neared, until the night before Christmas. Refusing to compromise, the people of Whistlebury decided they would split the town in 2. They would hold 2 parades, 2 carol singing events, 2 hot chocolate making contests, 2 of everything. That way, they didn't have to talk to the people who supported a different tree. The first dueling events were set for 9 p.m. Christmas Eve night, set to take place at the base of the 2 trees. People of different tree parties crossed each other on the street without stealing a glance at their opponents' grimaced faces as they headed to their respective trees. And that's when it happened. A sound rang out all across town. A sound that anyone living in Whistlebury for even the shortest amount of time would immediately recognize. A sound of a large pine tree cracking at its base and crashing to the ground. For the next few minutes, everyone was so surprised and so eager to know what happened, they forgot about hating each other, and they all ran through the 13 inches of snow to the site of Eric's tree. At the site where just 2 minutes earlier had stood one of 2 great junior pines, now stood a 2-foot stump. The 40-foot great pine lay in the snow next to it. People gasped. Some crumbled into the snow. Some yelled accusations, blaming Mark's men for the fatal act. No one knew what to do. That is, until a little 12-year-old girl noticed a small piece of paper flapping in the hillside wind, nailed to the stump. She grabbed the paper, eyes quickly scanning each word. She couldn't believe it. Turning to the crowd, whose eyes were frozen on her, she read the note in the loudest voice she could muster. Today I realized that everything I worked for and longed for the last 40 years is not really what I wanted most. I would gladly give up power, prestige, and fame to be part of a community that loves each other and comes together to solve its common problems. And so that is what I have done today. May we be one town again. Merry Christmas, Eric. When the little girl finished reading Eric's name, the crowd shrieked in utter shock. Eric had just cut down his own great pine. How could he? Heads quickly spun around to find Mark, who had, like many others, come running at the sound of the crack. but all they could see was his back as he hustled away. The people of Whistlebury began to make their way to Mark's great junior pine, some enthusiastically, some confused, almost dazed, and some begrudgingly. As they crunched through the snow on that mile-long walk across town, the reality of what Eric had done to his own tree and his own future began to set in. It was as if, with the falling of Eric's great junior pine, something else fell in the hearts of the people of Whistlebury. Their stubborn belief that they must be right, their anger that others thought differently from them, and their fear that those who disagreed with them would destroy Whistlebury. In its place settled a meek sense of service and a conviction that community and relationships were worth sacrificing for. This transformation was so profound and so widespread that by the time a critical mass had reached Mark's tree, what only minutes before would have been unfathomable, now was cheered. There at the base of the sole remaining great junior pine stood Mark, hunched over and sawing away. The most enthusiastic Mark supporters rushed to help, grabbing a handle of the saw and beginning the back and forth motion. When the 40-foot tree fell moments later, the crowd erupted with a cheer that made the needles sway on the pines up on the hillside. One selfless act had birthed another, and two had sent a shockwave of selflessness through the town. Whistlebury's claim to Christmas tree capital of the world had died, but the town and its people had never been more alive, more full of joy, and more secure in their hope. The Whistler brothers and the rest of the town would go on to rebuild the Christmas tree farm by developing an innovative drainage system for the forest. The team of Whistlebury residents who invented the system turned it into a business success, selling it all over the world. The drainage system also filled newly built water storage sites, solving the community's drought problems during the dry summer. Other innovations sprung up that made Whistlebury's Christmas tree industry far more successful than it had ever been before, while leading to many other thriving companies. When the community gathered around their new Great Pine 10 years later, Mark and Eric were gone, but their memory was forever captured in two stumps the town had covered in gold in their honor. Before breaking into a chorus of joy to the world, they grasped the hands of the people next to them and kneeled in the freezing snow, a physical representation of the lessons they had learned, to humble themselves and trust each other. They now knew with that foundation in Whistlebury, anything was possible.